We'll go ahead and get started then. I want to tell you right up front that today's lesson makes me both excited and nervous. It makes me excited and nervous. I'm excited because I think there's going to be some really, really good things that we're going to learn as we go through this study. Right? If we're going to be looking at the topic of wisdom, I think there's going to be some really good things that I'm going to learn. I suspect there's going to be some good things that you're going to learn, and I'm excited about that. On the other hand, as we study the book of Proverbs and as we study biblical wisdom, I'm also a little nervous. I'm a little nervous that wisdom is going to put a mirror to my face as I'm going to see places where I have not been very wise and I've been very much a fool. And, I fully expect that there's going to be some humbling lessons along the way. Who knows, maybe even today. So I want to acknowledge that this is going to be a study over the next several weeks that will not be for the faint of heart. Right? It's going to take some amount of courage for us to go through this. But if we're going to do a comprehensive study of wisdom, I think it's appropriate that we start in the beginning, at least where we would start in the beginning chronologically in Scripture. And for that means we will turn to the book of John. Turn to the book of John, chapter 1. And for those of you that want to read along with me, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." And so you may wonder, why are we starting in John and not in Genesis? And it's because this piece of Scripture is set before the story of creation that we find in Genesis. Now, a little bit of Bible trivia. The Old Testament was written largely in Hebrew. It was recorded on scrolls, they rolled them up, and if you were to go through all your Old Testament, all of that stuff was originally written in Hebrew with a couple exceptions. There's a couple passages in the book of Daniel that was written in Aramaic. Okay, so general rule of thumb is Old Testament written in Hebrew. Now, when we look at the New Testament was not written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek. It was written in Greek. So I want you just to have that whenever you play biblical Trivial Pursuit, or maybe you're on Jeopardy and this comes the answer. I want you to be able to nail that question, right? That's where we are. But when John writes this in the Gospel of John, he's writing this in Greek. And there's going to be people reading this in Greek, right? And so what I want to do is I want to start out and give you this foundation about how the Greeks put this tremendous emphasis on gaining knowledge. Knowledge was so important. Wisdom was so important to the ancient Greeks. And I want you to think about this. You've probably heard of some of these people. And as I was doing this, I thought, are there any famous Greek smart people? Anybody think of any famous Greek smart people? Well, you know how I like my biblical math. There was this guy, his name was Pythagoras. Oh, yeah. You were thinking of him too? To my students there in the back, have you ever studied triangles in math? You have triangles in math, and Pythagoras tells us that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? That's something that the Greeks figured out all those thousands of years ago. We still use it today, right? It's wisdom that the Greeks found. There was another guy that you probably heard about. His name was Socrates. Anybody ever heard of Socrates? Right? Famous from being in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, right? It was like, that's probably his biggest contribution to my life, right? But Socrates, he came up with what's known as the Socratic method, and it's a technique of asking questions to stimulate critical thinking and uncover underlying assumptions. It is a foundational it's a foundational tool used in modern education and debate. So Socrates is somebody that you've heard of. Now Socrates had a student. His name was Plato. Right? Plato has this idea. He had something that was called forms, and I didn't really know what this is, but it absolutely made sense as I was looking at it. Plato developed the theory of forms, and the idea was this: is that everything we see is somehow a reflection, is an imperfect reflection of something more perfect. And I thought, isn't that interesting? So the idea would be this: how many flowers have you seen? You've seen a bunch of flowers, but they don't all look the same, but they all sort of point towards there is some idealized, perfect type of flower. And I thought, that's sort of what we're looking for as we look for heaven, right? We see different things. Anybody ever been to Krispy Kreme donuts? Have you been there when the hot light is on? That is a form of heaven. Right? Right? I mean, like you see that and you say, surely there's something like this in heaven. What was that?
Well, you got me wondering now. I've never seen it. I don't know what it is.
Oh, well, we're taking a field trip. Maybe next Sunday we'll just meet at Krispy Kreme's, right? There's these things. We see imperfect things on earth, but we know there's a more perfect form in heaven. And that was something that Plato thought about a lot. And then the last guy that in this particular group is Aristotle. Aristotle, right? And he had this idea of logic and empirical observation. It's through him that we get something today that we call the scientific method. So prior to Aristotle, there were a lot of like supernatural explanations for things, and he's like, well, maybe there's other ways that we can do this, and he started off to do this. Those of you that work in healthcare, there's this Greek guy known as Hippocrates, right? And through him, you get the Hippocratic Oath. It's what doctors take that says, "I will do no harm to my patients," right? We have all these guys. The last guy I would give you is a guy by the name of Archimedes, just because I think that's a cool name. You were at a baby shower yesterday. They're going to have a little boy. Is Archimedes on the list? I think it should be. Yeah, my cousin Greg, before he was born, my uncle Greg, we were having conversations around what he was going to name his son, and he was reasonably sure he was going to name him Ezekiel, and he had the nickname of Zeke before he was born, and it stuck with him now for all these years. But Archimedes is the one who has the lever and fulcrum. Those of you who work in construction or anything like that, the lever and fulcrum, Archimedes is the guy who figured that out. So to the Greeks, they were all about gaining wisdom. And you have some of these folks here that have just made lasting contributions to the world in their pursuit of wisdom and knowledge. So when we look at the opening to the Gospel of John, he says, "In the beginning was the Word." Now, Word is how it translates in English, but in Greek, it is the word logos. And this is significant. This is significant because in Greek, this word references the supreme or ultimate intelligence or wisdom. Right? The Greeks were all about how can we be smart? What's wisdom? This stuff. And John starts out and says, "In the beginning was this ultimate wisdom." And he says, "And this wisdom was with God, and this wisdom was God. And what he does is he goes on to say that this wisdom became embodied in the person of Jesus. Wisdom was there in the beginning, and John tells us that Logos is Jesus. And that gets the attention of the ancients, right? His use of the word Logos here would have had immediately connected with the Greek audience, who just had wisdom as this in this very high regard. And he said, it came to life, and it walked among us. And it was this person of Jesus. Now, what we also need to come up, or what we need to recognize is this, is that wisdom is not something that happened after the fact. It wasn't that God started to create things and all of a sudden he's like, oh, I probably need some wisdom to go along with this. Wisdom happened before that. And because there was this wisdom, that's how all things were created. Now, we could go into an elaborate study of creation, and you will see wisdom at work. You will see how those things match up and how it follows a nice pattern. Like, we have to have sky and water before we have birds and fish. It doesn't happen the other way around. Right? So, the fact of the matter is, man has been trying to figure out wisdom ever since. So, now that we see Jesus as the very embodiment of wisdom, from the beginning, I want to take you to the book of Proverbs. We're going to turn, if you turn with me, if you would, to the book of Proverbs, written by Solomon. And Solomon was known as the wisest man to ever live. And Solomon's going to start out to help us understand what is this divine wisdom and how he can share it with us. So if you would, turn with me, Proverbs chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 7. 1 through 7. It says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. And verse 7 reads, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So, before we go deeper into this, I want to talk about the role of Proverbs themselves. You see, generally speaking, Proverbs are short, memorable sayings or phrases that express some type of timeless truth or principle. Oftentimes what you'll do is you will see a proverb and it will contrast things, right? We're going to spend a lot of time just on verse 7 here this morning, right? And when you look at this, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but, right, that's a contrast. We're going to look at something in the opposite direction, and that's to help give us a full or a better understanding of what's going on with this particular proverb. So Solomon has taken all this wisdom that he has acquired in his life, and he's put them into these proverbs and recorded them here for us today. Now, the idea is that you will hear these proverbs, and you will not just hear them, but you will accept them. You will internalize them, that you will use them to your benefit. That will not come in one ear and go out the other, right? You will use that to benefit yourself and ultimately for other benefits as well. And that purpose is laid out pretty obviously here in the opening few verses. He says, wisdom is, to gain wisdom and instruction, you want to receive guidance to do what's right, and to do what's just. You want to give knowledge to the inexperienced, right? You're going to use this to help somebody else. The wise are going to get more wisdom. Wise people say, you know what, I think there's still more for me to get. And it says, essentially what we're going to have is we have a treasure chest of wisdom to be digging in as we go through the book of Proverbs. But like any treasure, you have to dig for it. You got to dig for it. You have to be open-minded. You got to be able to use that. So with that, as we look through these first few verses, is there anything that stands out specifically to you? Does anybody see anything in those first 6 or 7 verses that you look at and you say, Verse 7?
Yeah.
Okay. What sticks out to you about verse 7?
It almost changed my word for the year. My word for the year was now.
Mm-hmm.
But like as I'm going on right now, I'd like to change my word to be like works. You know, if I have some wisdom, what are my works from my wisdom?
Okay.
But you know, I know some things.
Mm-hmm.
But more times than not, I don't do it.
Anybody else have that issue? Anybody else know the right thing to do and then not do it? Right? Like, that probably describes a lot of us, right? What stood out to me was verse 5. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. If they're already wise, don't they have enough? Why would they? Like you've met people like this. We call them know-it-alls, right? You've met people like this, right? Ron's laughing really hard. He must really know that. Oh, he's he's trying to pass the buck, right? We know there's people that know it all, right? There's people that you start your sentence, they finish it. Like, I was in meetings like that. I would say, I have a question. My question is, and I wouldn't even get the question out, and somebody else would say, oh, I know your question's going to be blah, 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 and the answer to that is blah, 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 blah. Does that answer your question? At which point, I felt a great deal of satisfaction saying, no, that wasn't my question at all. I was like, we went off to Pluto in that, right? So we need to recognize that wise people recognize that there is always room to learn more. Wise people understand that in seeking Jesus, it's not, it's one thing to be saved, but there's steps beyond that, right? There's a deeper relationship that comes. There's always, those of you that have been believers for many, many years, has anybody learned anything new this year or in the last several months about Jesus? A lot of us have. And how about this? The wise would also set the anticipation that they would continue to learn more. Not that, I guess I know everything about Jesus, we'll just go from here. Right? They have a certain perspective on that. But as you gain this wisdom, what do you do with it? And this made verse 6 jump off the page at me. It said, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. Proverbs tells us that the wise speak in parables, proverbs, sayings, and riddles. That's how the wise speak. Does that sound familiar at all? Does that just make any connection for any of you? Is there anything in there that makes a connection to me? What made a connection to me was the parable. How did Jesus teach? He taught in parables. He was wise enough that he could teach in a way that would just be able to connect with the people who were there to listen to him. Jesus would often teach with parables, and he would then later explain them to his disciples if they were still confused on that. And I think there's probably a better place as we go through this study, but I want to get this teaching point out right now up front. And it's that if you have wisdom, what do you do with it? If you have wisdom, what do you do with it? And I think the answer to this we can find in what Jesus did and said himself. So if you would, turn with me to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, verses 25, 26, 27, and 28. Now, just as a bit of context, there was some conversations happening. People were really concerned about who was going to have the right status, right? There was this concern. A mother had come up and said, hey, can you give my boys some special treatment? Moms, have you ever asked for special treatment for your kids? It's probably a very reasonable thing to consider, right? Right? And it says, Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. This is Jesus, the embodiment of wisdom, saying that's not how you do it. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. What did Jesus do with the wisdom he had? Did he lord it over them like the rulers of the world? No, he used it to serve others. He used it to make life better for the people around him. And to some extent, this core value that we have very much models Jesus' perspective on how to steward, like there's a stewardship part of your wisdom. Do you use that to help others? He served others. He used it to lift people up. He did not use his wisdom to put people down. He would challenge people. He would challenge the Pharisees. He would say, you think you're wise, but you are not. And he would challenge them to think just a little bit differently. And I think that's the real challenge of wisdom, to use the wisdom that you have to serve and uplift others. At the same time, we need to recognize the opposite. What do the foolish do? The foolish would use their wisdom for selfish reasons. They would use their wisdom to enrich themselves and to do that at the expense of others. With whatever wisdom we currently have, we should be using the wisdom we currently have to serve others. And we should remain in pursuit of more wisdom. Now, with that, there's some good news. What that means is that we all have some amount of wisdom, right? And I'm going to hazard a guess that you can use the wisdom that you have, or you can think about the wisdom that you have, and you can turn around, you can see how you've used that to the benefit of others, how you've used that to lift other people up, right? You probably can have that. But I think at the same time, I can say with some degree of confidence that we all have room for additional wisdom. Anybody have room for more wisdom in their life? Those of you that have talked to me before know I've got a lot more room for wisdom in my life. right? That's where we are. So we need to recognize that we have this capacity for more. And the question becomes, how do you get it? How do you get more wisdom? It's one thing to know that you need it, or it's one thing to know that you have the capacity for it. It's another thing to say, okay, how do I get it? How do I keep it? Right? How do I do that? I think last week we looked at a passage in James where he said, you just need to ask God for wisdom. Right? Solomon, I think, gives us another clue in verse 7. In verse 7, Solomon says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, how many of you, look at the punctuation in that sentence? Do you have a period after the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge? And if not, what punctuation do you have? Who has a comma? Anybody have a period at the end of that? Anybody? But I'm going to hazard a guess that you have encountered somebody who has put a period at the end of that sentence, or at the end of that phrase, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of knowledge, period. Right? A friend of mine went on social media and was very confused by this. And I don't even remember what, it probably was some political thing, because this person tends to get caught up in political activities. Very opinionated, and that's fine. I appreciate that somebody has an opinion. But says, I don't know how anybody could worship a God that they fear. Isn't God supposed to be love? And so, I don't know about you, but I would say that love and fear sometimes don't really seem like they are congruent type perspectives, right? They seem to be in some type of conflict with one another. So I think this gives us an excellent example. Those of you that have the Bible app on your phone, this is going to be a time I encourage you to get that out and look up Proverbs chapter 1. It's the NIV says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And so this is where it starts. The beginning of knowledge starts with the fear of the Lord. And so that seems to suggest a particular posture. Like if you're fearful of somebody, you have a different posture around them than if you love somebody. Do you not? But I think if we look at some different translations here, and I'm going to encourage you to, whoever has their Bible app out, toggle through whatever different translations you want to look at and see if you can find one that does not use the word fear. I have about 4 or 5 different ones here. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. But what it is it just gives us something, because as we translate from Hebrew to English or Greek to English, sometimes the words don't match up one for one, right? Sometimes there's a little different flavor that we get. So as we look at this, we have fear, but there might be some other words. Does anybody, you have one?
Respect.
Respect. What type of, what translation is that?
That is the
Contemporary
contemporary
CEV. Okay. Anybody else have one?
bowing down.
Bowing down. And what translation is that, Gary? Message. Okay. Anybody else? You have one?
I was going to say, amplified is
So because it's amplified, that's an awful lot to write down. But there's a lot of good stuff there. So amplified. I grabbed the Good News translation. It said, to have knowledge, you must first have reverence for the Lord. It goes on to say, stupid people have no respect for wisdom and refuse to learn. The Message said, starting with God, the first step is learning to bow down to God. Only fools thumb their noses at such wisdom and learning. Right? So these are different translations, paraphrases, whatever. But it just gives us a more comprehensive look at what we're examining here. Let me just remind you that Proverbs often deal with contrast. So we have fear, we have respect, we have bowing down, we have reverence, and that is often contrasted. This is what the wise do, and what do the fools do. So there's some other part of this as well. So what do we see there? Corinne, do you still have that CEV? What's it say about, what's the second half of that say?
Only a fool rejects wisdom and gives advice.
So we have rejection. Oh, let's reject, that's here. Good News translation says, stupid people have no respect for wisdom and refuse. So we have, I didn't put that one up here, did I? Did I put that one up here? Reverence. Getting myself all confused. So the opposite of reverence was disrespect and refuse. Trace with amplified. What's the second half of that?
Arrogant fools despise skillful and godly wisdom and instruction in self.
Despise. I don't even know how to spell despise. I think that's how you spell it. Gary, you had the Message. It said they bow down. The other side of that is thumb their noses. Right? So we have these contrasts. And the take home of all of this, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I'm doing bad on time. The take home of all this is I'm going to call it a posture. How do you present? How do you present to wisdom? What does these types of postures look like? What do these types of postures look like? And Solomon tells us that these are the postures that we need so that when God gives us wisdom, we catch it. We can keep it. But if we have these types of postures, what are you going to do when that wisdom comes your way? You're not going to get it. You're going to reject it. You're going to, like all those things, you're going to refuse it. Those are the things that we that we see. To distill it down, wise people are willing to learn, foolish people are not. Wise people are willing to obey God, foolish people would not be willing to obey God. I would go so far as to say I think wise people are more fearful of not doing what God tells them to do. God tells them to do something. The wise say, I better do that. If I don't do it, that could be troublesome. Right? But what if God tells the wise to do something hard or challenging? The wise, out of respect or fear or reverence, must reason that that this is the better scenario than not doing what God has told them to do. Every Sunday, we start out with core values. We talk about how Jesus always values people, right? That's what we start out with every Sunday. Why does Jesus value all people? He values all people because God took the time to make that person. That person is a unique masterpiece of the Creator. I want you to look all around this room. There's nothing but masterpieces in this room. I mean, seriously, turn your head, look around. There's masterpieces in this room. God took the time to make each one of us. And Jesus said, I'm going to value each one because that's what God did. Now, what happens in the world? Do we see masterpieces in the world? Or do you know anybody that doesn't see masterpieces in the world? I think we all know that, right? We live in a world where people will refuse to value others for any number of useless reasons. Solomon sought wisdom from God. But I want you to know there's another group. When you think of, Solomon's this wise guy, can you think of any other wise guys in the Bible? Maybe you'll remember more easily if I said, can you think of any wise men in the Bible? Where do we find these folks? There's a story about 1,000 years after the time of Solomon. And we can read this story in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi, or wise men from the east, came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. The embodiment of wisdom comes to earth. What did these wise men do? They said, we got to seek it. We got to go find it. The wise came to seek wisdom. I realize that we are just a little beyond Christmas time here, but it is not uncommon in the weeks and months leading up to Christmas to see some sign to the effect of that says, wise men still seek him. Wise men seek wisdom. Wisdom starts from the fear of the Lord. It starts from an awe-filled reverence that compels us to listen, it compels us to learn, and it compels us to obey. It's a posture of humility that trusts that God's way is better, even when God's way is hard. Proverbs paints a clear contrast. Wise people learn, fools reject instruction. And Jesus, the embodiment of wisdom, gave his life to serve others. And so the question comes to us, what will we do with the wisdom that God gives us? Will we use it to lift others up, like Jesus taught us to serve? this week, I want to encourage you. Where do you need to ask God for wisdom? I want to encourage you to consider, how can you use the wisdom that God has already given you to serve someone, or to serve someone better? I started off telling you that I was excited and I was a little nervous about this study, this lesson. And it's going to take some courage to go through and to exercise some of the wisdom that we have. I can say that with a reasonable amount of certainty. But as we go through this study over the next weeks and months, I want you to remember that learning wisdom takes courage, humility, and the willingness to grow. But the reward, if you accept those, can be life-changing. So let us commit to be seekers of wisdom, that we can use the wisdom that God provides us to build His kingdom. So let me encourage you as you go through this week to have that posture of humility as you seek wisdom. With that, I'll put my 3 letters on the board, ACT. Based on what we have looked at this morning, what action will you take? What change will you make? And is there something that you learned this morning that you can teach to somebody else for your benefit and theirs?